hear it because you're talking about microphone.
Check test 2 1 2. Yeah, hey.
Am I okay?
Okay, your transmitter has decided to stop working.
Okay. Test, test, 3, 2, 1. Test, test. All righty. How am I doing on time? Good morning, and welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. My name is Lisa Nicole Matthews, and I'm the 114th president of the National Press Club and assignment manager for U.S. Video at the Associated Press. Thank you for joining us today for our Headliners event with Texas Congressman Joaquin Castro. We'll get started in a moment, but just a reminder that we are happy to accept your questions and will ask as many as time permits. To submit a question, please email headliners@press.org. The 73rd Annual Emmy Awards aired Sunday night with predictable sweeps for the big budget drama The Crown and the breakthrough comedy Ted Lasso. But another thing proved predictable as well. White actors swept all 12 lead and supporting categories. Despite much hand-wringing in Hollywood over the past 2 years about the lack of diversity in such award shows and in the profession in general, we woke Monday morning to the Twitter hashtag #EmmiesSoWhite. Our speaker today believes the underrepresentation of Latinos in Hollywood is not only a failure of artistic vision and a dangerous representation of America's largest minority, but also a potential violation of federal law. Texas Congressman Joaquin Castro, former chair of the Hispanic Congressional Caucus, also thinks Americans should not be rewarding what he believes is a discriminatory industry with tax breaks meant to encourage filming in states and cities. A native of San Antonio and Harvard-educated lawyer, Castro has asked the Government Accountability Office to report the number of Latinos working in film, television, and book publishing to determine whether the industries are following existing labor laws or if new laws are needed. You know, it's worth noting that this is Hispanic Heritage Month. A 2019 report from the Motion Picture Association of America found that Hispanic and Latino Americans have the highest per capita theater attendance among all ethnicities in the country. Another report from the USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative offers evidence that despite national attention, Hispanics and Latinos are still neglected in popular films. In fact, the study found that 7% of major films in 2019 featured a lead Hispanic or Latino actor, just 7%. So Congressman Castro is taking steps to make a change. He has met with industry leaders, including news organizations, to find ways to increase the hiring of Latinos in all media. And we look forward to hearing more from him today. So please join me in giving a warm National Press Club welcome to Congressman Joaquin Castro.
It's great to be with you. I'm Joaquin Castro, and I proudly represent my hometown of San Antonio, Texas, in the United States Congress and the House of Representatives. I want to say thank you, Lisa, for that very kind introduction and introduction about my work as well for the past 2.5 or 3 years. And thank you to Peter Copeland for the invitation to be here with you today at the National Press Club. It's wonderful to be at the National Press Club to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month and to discuss an important issue, the missing Latino narrative in American society and the media's role in it, especially Hollywood. As the latest census numbers show, Latinos are nearly 1 in 5 Americans, about almost 19% of the US population. And in my home state of Texas, Latinos are 40% of the state's population, including a majority of Texas students today. But despite our growing population, Latinos still face a persistent invisibility in American society. course, we live not only in the southwestern United States, but across this nation in emerging communities in states like Rhode Island, Utah, Kansas, Nebraska. So not just the large states of Texas and Florida, New York, and California. We're not only recent immigrants, but many of our families have lived in the United States for generations. Many families are like mine. Next year marks 100 years since my grandmother, Victoria Castro, moved from Mexico to Texas as a 6 or 7-year-old orphan. And on her immigration documents, where it asked the purpose of her visit, her relatives at the time wrote in the words, "to live," that she was coming to the United States to live. My brother and I grew up in a household that was very engaged in grassroots politics. In fact, my parents were involved in the Mexican-American Civil Rights Movement, or the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 1970s. And so the issues of civil rights, voting rights, equal opportunity, and fair representation are of great importance to me and to my family, and ones that I literally have grown up around my entire life. And I'm very proud of that. And I've long believed that issues of economic and social justice are coupled with issues of cultural advancement. So I want to start today with a brief story that I think summarizes the challenge very well. As chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, I convened a meeting in May of 2020 with a group of publishers. And in that meeting was the CEO of one of the top 5 publishing companies in the country. And I asked this very accomplished, very bright, very ambitious man, he was probably 50-something years old, I asked him a very simple question. I asked him whether he could name 3 Latinos or Latinas who had had a significant impact in American history. And this very accomplished man whose company publishes not only fiction and nonfiction books, but also textbooks for our schools and universities, he thought about my question for a second, and there were 20 or 30 of us on the Zoom call. And he finally said, "No, I can't." And this man wasn't trying to be rude. He wasn't being dismissive of my question. We were having a very earnest conversation. And yet, this very bright person could not name 3 Latinos or Latinas who had made a significant impact in American history. And I want you to think about that for a moment, what it signifies and what it means. Because the contributions of Latinos to the prosperity of the United States are not widely known. And I'm convinced that if you asked the same question of many Americans, perhaps 80, 90% or more might give you the same answer that that CEO of a major textbook publishing company gave to me last year. The contributions of Latinos have been written out of American history and many state history textbooks. So this is a challenge in our education system as well. We've also been largely excluded from American media, including Hollywood. What this represents is a void in narrative in American society for a group that is almost 20% of the American population. And that void in narrative, that black hole, has been filled over the years by stereotypes that have been perpetrated by American media. Latinos as gangbangers, as drug dealers, as quote-unquote illegals. Latinas as hypersexual on screen and on television. Those stereotypes are then taken by unscrupulous politicians who abuse them for their own political gain. And the result, the marriage of those two things, is a dangerous mix that in its worst iteration produces the kind of tragedy that occurred in El Paso, Texas in August of 2019, where a madman drove 10 hours to stop what he called, quote-unquote, the Hispanic invasion of Texas. So the systemic exclusion of Latinos in American society is dangerous. And it's dangerous not only for Latinos, but really for all Americans. That gunman in El Paso killed 23 people and injured many more, including people who were not Latino or Hispanic. This missing narrative, this systemic exclusion, is not only dangerous for Latinos, again, but dangerous for everyone, And this work is not only about representation, it's about how the lack of representation in the media affects the portrayal of Latinos and really all Americans. The media industry, and Hollywood in particular, is still the main image-defining and narrative-creating institution of American society. And Latinos are mostly invisible in this industry. Just published today and described for the first time right now is a new report from the Government Accountability Office, or the GAO, as we know, an independent, nonpartisan agency that documents, an independent, nonpartisan agency, and this report documents the underrepresentation of Latinos in media, particularly in the film, television, news, and publishing industries. The report includes an analysis of Latino employment from entry level to executive suite in the media industry. I hope that this report is a wake-up call for the media industry. The GAO found that the media industry has a much smaller percentage of Latino workers than the rest of the American workforce. Specifically, Latinos are about 18% of the workforce outside of the media, but only 12% of workers within the media industry. So think about that. The media would need to increase its share of Latino workers by 50% to match the rest of the American workforce. But over the past few years, from 2014 to 2019, the report shows that Latino representation in the media industry has barely changed at all. And there's a significant disparity between media executives, those at the very top, which are about 80% white and only 4% Latino, and the service sector jobs in the media industry, as custodians, security guards, food preparers, where more than 1 in 5 workers, or 22%, are Latinos. So you can see that the workforce is concentrated in the service sector jobs within the media industry. The worst offenders within the industry are actually news organizations and publishing houses. The people responsible for delivering hard news, facts to the American people, did not reflect America's diverse population. At the New York Times, the paper of record for our nation, only 7% of staff are Latino. At the Washington Post, right here in our nation's capital, only 5% of employees are Latino. Even at the Los Angeles Times, in a city that's nearly 50% Latino, only 17% of reporters are Latinos. The fact is that some of America's most renowned media institutions are the largest and longest perpetrators of cultural exclusion. And just last week, some of you may have seen this, the archivist at the New Yorker, Aaron Overby, shared a very revealing analysis of that publication's track record on diversity and inclusion. For example, she noted that Latino writers have only published 7 book reviews, 1 profile, and not a single cinema review in print. And there was not a single cinema review in print by writers or critics of color in the last 30 years. And this is not to pick on a particular publication. I think their editor, David Remnick, is a brilliant journalist. They have great people who who work on their staff and work as reporters there. But it does signify an incredible cultural exclusion of a major population in the United States of America, and there are consequences to that the media must be cognizant of. The level of cultural exclusion in American media is shocking, and it should alarm all of us. And by and large, the American people do not know who Latinos are, where Latinos fit into U.S. history, and the contributions of Latinos to our nation's prosperity. It makes the Latino community almost ahistorical, seemingly disconnected from our role in American history. In other words, the Latino narrative is missing in American society. And this is not to take away from the wonderful work of journalists across the United States who day in and day out are publishing stories that do include many times the Latino community. But we can't ignore the inequity and systemic exclusion of Latinos in the media industry. And by the way, it's not only Latinos who face this challenge. For years in much of American media, especially in Hollywood, The African American story was largely confined to two periods, the periods of slavery and civil rights. Fortunately, we've seen progress in recent years with black creators and writers being able to share their stories in full. Muslim Americans, especially after 9/11, were often stereotyped as terrorists, and it impacted how their community was perceived within the United States and how their children perceived themselves. I would argue that Asian Americans have also suffered from a void in narrative that made them more vulnerable to a president who described a virus in racist terms and resulted in a horrible spike in hate crimes. And with today's GAO report, it's now a matter of public record that in America that Latinos are underrepresented in the media industry. And I want to recognize my colleagues at the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, the CHC, who care deeply about this issue, including the current chairman who succeeded me, Chairman Raul Ruiz of California. I also want to thank Chairwoman Carolyn Maloney of New York, who leads the House Oversight and Reform Committee, and Vice Chair Jimmy Gomez of California, who requested this GAO report along with the CHC when I was chairman. And this is just the first part of the government watchdog's analysis. Next year, the GAO will publish the second part of their report, comparing Latino underrepresentation in the media to other major industries, and also look at the role of federal regulators, the Department of Labor, the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, and the Federal Communications Commission, and their track record on enforcing anti-discrimination laws. I would also be remiss if I didn't recognize the advocates in media and film who have been doing this work for many years, pushing the industry, often at a great personal and professional sacrifice. Some among them include Brenda Castillo and the National Hispanic Media Coalition, Felix Sanchez, who's here in Washington, D.C., and the National Hispanic Foundation for the Arts. Folks like the National Association of Latino Independent Producers, and so many others who have worked tirelessly to open the doors in the industry and tell Latino stories. The National Association of Hispanic Journalists in journalism as well. And look, I've tried not only to criticize the lack of Latino representation, but also to work in earnest to improve this problem. I want to speak specifically about Hollywood for a moment. After the El Paso tragedy in 2019, I really put my foot on the gas on this issue. I led a congressional oversight delegation to Los Angeles to meet with Latino talent, unions and guilds, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and with major Hollywood studios. And it was clear that for at least some, while they were aware of the issue of lack of Latino representation, it was not a priority, I felt, for many of the executives. Many of the companies and organizations were not even keeping track of the demographics of their workforce. But just last week, the University of Southern California's Annenberg Inclusion Initiative published an alarming new study showing that Latinos are almost invisible in Hollywood films and often portrayed in negative stereotypes and hardly even given a chance to direct movies. On the big screen, only 7% of films featured a lead and co-lead Latino actor in 2019. And Latinas represented less than 2% of all leads and co-leads across more than 1,300 films. And then, when Latinos are included, more than 40% of top-billed Latinos across 100 movies were depicted as criminals in 2019. And behind the camera, only about 4% of directors were Latinos or Latinas. And this is what systemic exclusion looks like in an industry. And it's not like Latinos don't go to the movies. In fact, Latinos are about 19% of the population, but 29% of the purchasers of movie tickets. As consumers, Latinos are literally the lifeblood of the entertainment industry, not just in terms of ticket purchasers, but also over-indexing on streaming. I applaud the research of others, including Dr. Ana Cristina Ramon at UCLA, to highlight this very irony. And look, all of us love the American entertainment that we've taken in over the years. We love movies and films. I grew up in the 1980s watching the Dukes of Hazzard and Dallas and the Breakfast Club. We all appreciate the entertainment that we've seen in film and television. But when it comes to cultural representation, there is a dark side to this industry that I'm determined to shine a light on. People often think of Hollywood as a progressive industry, and on some issues, it certainly is. But when it comes to diversity and inclusion of Latinos, Hollywood is more regressive than most American industries, and because of that, more dangerous. As you all know, every industry produces a product, and oftentimes a byproduct. For example, the oil and gas industry produces energy, but it also produces carbon emissions. The tech industry produces platforms that connect us, but also those platforms help spread disinformation. Hollywood produces entertainment, but over the years, it has also produced damaging and dangerous stereotypes. So I started working with members of Congress and with state lawmakers around the country about this exclusion, including the Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators led by Executive Director Kenneth Romero, who's been a champion on this very issue. And as you know, state governments give very generous tax breaks to Hollywood in the form of production tax credits. And I looked at this from the perspective of a lawmaker, a policymaker. If you're a lawmaker representing a community that is 64% Latino, like mine, or it could be a community that's overwhelmingly African American or Asian American, how does it make sense to subsidize an industry where your community, the people you represent, are only getting a tiny fraction of the jobs in that industry? No community should be asked to subsidize its own exclusion. And Latinos should not subsidize our own exclusion as taxpayers. We're already subsidizing the industry as streamers, as purchasers of movie tickets. I've been very impressed by state lawmakers like Wendy Carrillo in the California State Assembly, who have successfully pushed legislation signed into law by Governor Newsom so that the California film tax credit will now be directly connected to companies' plans to ensure their workforce reflects the diversity of our communities. That's a good step in the right direction, and I hope other state legislators who offer similar tax breaks will take up this same measure. I also want to recognize Chairman Jerry Nadler of New York, who leads the House Judiciary Committee, and last year, at the request of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, held a landmark hearing on Latino representation in Hollywood. From state houses to the halls of Congress, lawmakers are focused on this issue and working hard to advance the inclusion of Latinos in American media and in Hollywood. Working with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, we've held meetings with the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Meredith, Condé Nast, the Hearst Corporation, Comcast NBC Universal, Telemundo, Univision, Disney, Netflix, Amazon Studios, the Academy, the Sundance Festival, and many more. The purpose of these engagements has been to push the industry on their practices and directly confront company executives on their systemic exclusion of Latinos. And this issue won't fade away over time without a meaningful change in representation. Again, because that representation affects the portrayals that come out of American media. Now, it's an established fact that thanks to the GAO report and many others, Latinos are underrepresented in the media industry. The question now is whether the industry, in film, in television, in books, in news, will accept the challenge to break down barriers and unlock closed doors so Latinos can tell their stories. It's also a call for policymakers to greater scrutinize and discern the incentives that they're providing to the media industry in the United States of America, specifically to Hollywood and its tax production credits. Oftentimes, the industry, various industries, will tell you that we're just going to go by the numbers. This is a business. Well, as a policymaker, if I'm looking at the return that the people I represent are getting in terms of jobs from the entertainment industry, and we just go by the numbers, then many of the tax incentive credits out there are not worthwhile. That's simply a fact. And so I want to leave you with this. The thought about what it means for an 8-year-old Latina who is growing up in Texas or California or Nebraska or wherever it may be, to not only never or hardly ever read about anyone from her community in history textbooks who has made a significant contribution to the nation's history. Never to learn about it, but also to be such an avid consumer of films, of television, of streaming content, and also to hardly ever see herself and people like her reflected in that media. What it means for a person, for a young girl like that, growing up in the United States of America in 2021. And let us all resolve in our own roles to help change that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman.
Thank you.
Wow. Lots of questions to ask.
Some food for thought, that's for sure.
Yeah, sure enough. We both have done a little bit of reading on the latest reports and findings. So you kind of, I mean, you definitely outlined what it is that kind of made you go after Hollywood. But was it really just the situation that happened in Texas with the shooting in El Paso, or was there something even before that that made you want to take this on as an issue?
You know, it was an issue. I'm in my 19th year of public service. I started in the state legislature in Texas when I was 28 years old in 2003. And it's an issue over the years that I'd been thinking about. And it was one of those things, I think as a policymaker, we all have them, where there's things that you really want to get to, but it always seems like there's some issue that's more immediate in front of you. Whether it's fighting voter suppression, or pushing for the Affordable Care Act, or universal health care, or the immigration battles. And so I felt like it was one of those things that there was always something more immediate that I had to get to. And I finally resolved, as chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, that this was one of the initiatives that we would take on. But it was what happened in August of 2019 in El Paso, when this man basically bought wholesale into the stereotypes about Latinos, both, I think, historical stereotypes that have come out of entertainment and American media, as Latinos as illegal and so forth, but also those stereotypes then getting abused in my world of politics by politicians. And that dangerous combination led this man to believe that these Latinos were invaders to Texas. And so then I really went for it at that point and organized that CODEL, that official congressional delegation visit to Los Angeles in 2019.
So what kind of leverage do you think you have or Congress has over Hollywood to get them to make the changes that you're proposing, those suggestions?
That's a great question. And I think early on, people wondered, well, why is somebody from Washington, why are you paying attention to this? What does it matter? Some people, I remember, even other legislators, saw this as a kind of fluffy issue. This is a foundational issue, representation and portrayal within the media industry, because again, this is the main image-defining and narrative-creating institution in the country. So, in terms of our leverage, number one, I would prefer that this be collaborative with the industry, rather than us battling it out and then they're just upset at people and you're upset at them. I want it to be collaborative, but industries sometimes don't change unless you put real pressure on them. I think that's true of many American industries. So I look to figure out how can we make a difference. And so on the positive side, for example, we've tried to expand the definition of federal apprenticeships to include media and entertainment so that there is more money that goes for apprenticeships in the industry to make it easier for them to do what is the equivalent of paid internships, for example, for folks coming into the industry. But on the other end, we've also said, besides carrots, that there are sticks out there. There are states like New Mexico and Georgia and California that offer very significant tax credits to the industry. And I pose the question to the industry, if I'm in Georgia, and I want to take the example not of race and ethnicity, but of women. Women in directing films. I believe it was the year 2018. In directing, it was a banner year for women. Women directed 10% of American films in 2018. Well, Georgia is more than 50% female. I'm pretty sure about that. And so if you're a Georgia lawmaker, legislator, and I'm not casting aspersions at the legislators who have passed these tax credits, but I do think that we have to take a more discerning look, a more scrutinizing look at what we're offering, because in some industries, including this one, people are basically subsidizing their own exclusion. So that's a big part of it. In addition, I think, as I noted, the report will go through other issues of discrimination. We have talked about asking the Department of Labor and the EEOC to look specifically at the issue of discrimination against Latinos in the industry. And so most of all, I said, look, we have a role to play. Every industry comes before Congress and asks for something. And as they ask for something, I have to make sure that that's in the best interest of the people I represent. And you know, it's no more free rides for folks.
A couple of things on that, because you know, a number of the items that you just discussed requires there to be some level of diversity amongst the leadership or in the legislature or places where those decisions are being made. Right. So where does the change begin? You know, is it in our newsrooms? Is it in hiring practices? You know, where do you begin?
Well, I think there's two main components to this, and what we try to work with everybody on is the first pillar is transparency. That everybody be transparent with their numbers, not just on Latinos, on African Americans, on women's, and so forth. Because what I noticed is if a company or an institution refuses to be transparent, then they're probably not going to take that second larger step, which is accountability. And so first we ask for transparency. The second step is accountability and working towards improvement. And you can tell that there are some companies more than others who are earnestly focused on that improvement. And for some, quite honestly, it's just lip service or performative. For others, I believe that it's sincere, that they do want to change. I'll tell you, lately, the Hearst Corporation has been great in engaging us on this issue. But there are others that have been more reluctant. So it's a challenge all around. I think it's also incumbent upon the companies to take it upon themselves and really change from within and bring people in who can help them change, because it really represents a disservice to a large segment of the American population.
So is the biggest problem the lack of Latino employment in the industry or the images of Latinos on the screen?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because it's two separate things, right? I'm really describing two separate things.
Right.
I'm describing the representation piece, which is the numbers, but then secondarily, the portrayal piece, which is particularly apt to Hollywood.
Right.
And the images and the storylines that you're seeing. But the first thing affects the other thing. So I believe that the more representation, the better representation you have at media companies, including in entertainment, the more accurate portrayals that you'll get on the other side in terms of the product that comes out. Now, I've also noticed something very pernicious that happens with Latinos. I think for years, I think it happened with African American creators. Because the industry confined them to a certain lane, so to speak, to certain stereotypes, this pernicious thing happens where Latino and Latina creators, knowing that the only thing the studios will buy is the gangbanger, is the immigration story, is the housemaid, start to try to sell that story or that project to the studios because it's the only thing they're buying. And so you get into this very vicious cycle where the studios want this, that's the only thing they're buying, and even a lot of the Latina creators, because they obviously, that's their line of work, and you know, they're creating content, but the door is shut to them on a fuller account of Latino life, they start feeding the studios what they want. Mm-hmm. And it's a very pernicious, vicious cycle.
Oh, man. So should there be requirements for Latino employment before the projects get those tax incentives that they're currently getting?
I think that those industries, to get the tax production credits, should hit certain criteria, just like you would hit any other criteria with amount of dollars spent, for example, or percentage of the project that is located in a particular state or region. And so, you know, we're not asking for a specific quota. You've got to have exactly X number of people. But to be honest with you, even if they set aspirational goals, the numbers right now for Latinos in front of the camera are about often between 3 and 5%. So, you know, it's almost a situation where there's nowhere to go but up, hopefully, right? Although despite what the study says, that for the whole industry, not just in terms of who's in front of the camera, but also who's working as the custodian, who's working as a secretary, who's working as a staff assistant in media, the numbers have not really budged they didn't budge between 2014 and 2019.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that we're distinguishing between the media and news.
Sure.
Because it's very, very different.
That's right. It's an overarching category. And entertainment is separate from hard news.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
But as I mentioned, there are challenges in hard news as well, as you know, with the lack of Latino representation and Latina representation.
So how would you rate the news coverage of Latinos in general, and especially in Texas, where there are various border crises going on?
I think historically it has been prone to stereotypes. Historically, I'll give you an example, and you know, I know they're not going to like this, but I don't think that the flagship magazine of Texas over the years, Texas Monthly, did a great job of covering Latinos. You know, Latinos are 40% of the state of Texas, and if you look historically at that magazine, I just don't think it did a great job.
So, but we do have, who's doing a good job of covering Latinos, and has it made a difference now that we've got news networks, we have news networks that are completely dedicated to the Latin American, Hispanic American viewer?
Well, it's interesting because you have, at least on the hard news side, right? Let's put aside entertainment for a second. The major magazines in the country, I mentioned one of them, the New Yorker, and others, are not, I don't think, doing an especially good job. That's in magazine writing.
Right.
But those magazines influence the thought of a lot of legislators and others. And so that's magazines. I would say with broadcast journalism, I think it's a case where some, and same thing with print news, some are better than others. I'll give you an example. NBC has an NBC Latino division that's specifically dedicated to the coverage of Latinos. And they have a wonderful journalist over there, Suzanne Gamboa and others. However, there's also a matter of what resources are dedicated to that division, what resources are put into. It's not just a matter of having a division, but it's also a matter of how you support that division and its work. And same thing sometimes in broadcast. And I'll give you another quick example. I actually helped the Screen Actors Guild a few years back, probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, because the Spanish language actors and actresses who were performing in Spanish, but they were performing for Telemundo, which is owned by NBC, Comcast, NBC Universal, they were not being paid the same wages or being given the same benefits as the English language soap opera actors and actresses on NBC's station.
Right.
And so you see this differential there, and differential in treatment.
I have a question from Reina Diamante with Spectrum News, Texas. She asks, what tangible solutions could you see members of the media industry implement short-term to boost Latino representation, and what role does Congress play in that effort?
Well, first, I think the unionization, the renewed unionization at many of these organizations will help. The creation, like you have at the LA Times, for example, of a specific Latino caucus in the newsroom. You now have the same thing at the Washington Post. But you know, it's necessary not just in these flagship newspapers, national newspapers, but also in different parts of the country. But what I mean to say is invigorated organization, whether it's through the union or through caucuses like this, that are pushing the management and executives on this issue, including pushing them publicly and pointing out the inadequacies. And in terms of how Congress can be helpful on that, well, as I mentioned, we're going to be asking, and that will be part of the report, the full report that's coming out next spring, about any discrimination from a labor perspective, and considering asking the EEOC also to take a very close look at this issue. By the way, the EEOC years ago reviewed the same problem for women in Hollywood. And then there were some changes that were made after that, although if you look at the numbers, there's still a lot of work that remains to be done.
What about social media? What do you think the role of social media is in shaping the image of Latinos?
It's actually very important, and I've been saying for about 2.5 years now what I said today, which is I still believe, I say American media, but specifically Hollywood, is still the main image-defining and narrative-creating institution in the country. And to give that a little bit more context, what I mean is that they project out images and stories about groups of people that affects the way the rest of American society sees those groups of people. It affects the way people from within that own group see themselves. That matters it's not just a matter of which actor or actress is getting a role on television. To be honest with you, if it was just that, I probably wouldn't have gotten involved. Because you could look at any industry, the financial services industry, healthcare, anything, and there would be a lack of representation. But those images coming out of media affect every Latino or Latina who walks around with dark skin, who has a Spanish surname, and is applying for a job not only as an actor and actress, but as an accountant, as a teacher, as a firefighter, anything else in American society. And so that's why it's important. And that's why we have to continue to work on this.
So what about the argument that what you see on television and in film is fiction? It's not necessarily real life. People should use their own common sense and make decisions rationally.
Well, and let me tie this back into social media. People take from what they see on television, film, streaming, they take at least an impression of people and of groups that are characterized on those platforms. And to answer your social media question, social media, I think the most problematic thing about social media is that it spreads disinformation. And so it is actually, I think, catching up to Hollywood as a culprit of characterization and oftentimes of stereotype, but mostly for disinformation. The big difference between Hollywood and social media is that the culprits in Hollywood of bad portrayal and bad representation, the power there is concentrated among a select group of corporations and executives. The culprit in social media is actually the opposite. The disinformation is democratized, where oftentimes it's many among the American public who are posting fake things or disinformation on Facebook and on Instagram or on other platforms, Reddit.
But aren't there companies that are behind the
absolutely.
platforms, just
Absolutely.
like Hollywood?
You're right, actually. Yeah. And it's interesting because Mark Zuckerberg has been brought in front of the Congress multiple times.
Right.
But executives from Hollywood, we had a hearing last November, but you didn't see the head of Disney or the head of Netflix or the heads of any of the corporations in front of Congress. And I actually think that it would be fair to call executives from the media industry, particularly from Hollywood, in front of the American Congress. We've seen it for the financial services industry. Jamie Dimon has been brought in front of Congress numerous times. Mark Zuckerberg in social media or tech. The oil and gas industry certainly has been brought in front of Congress to answer for issues in its own industry. So there shouldn't be an industry that's off limits for whatever reason.
So is it time to regulate? Are you for regulating social media more and maybe even put regulations in the broader sense on media and Hollywood?
My answer to that question is that I would hope that we would not have to do that. You would hope that the industries would make a strong and sincere effort to correct themselves. But I do think with social media, and you know, I'm on the Intelligence Committee, went through the full round of the Russia investigation, and then the first impeachment, the second impeachment, and so forth. So yes, it's clear that on social media that policymakers at the national level, in particular the federal level, have to take a closer look at regulations that are helpful in stopping the spread of disinformation.
I would be remiss if I had you up here and I didn't ask you about some things that are happening now in the news. So, Texas abortion. This morning we heard about the case that was filed, two cases from folks who don't live in Texas against a doctor who said that he performed an abortion. And I'm just wondering, what's your take on where that state is going with laws like the one that is there? And do you think that it's really going to work?
Yes. The SB8, the anti-abortion law in Texas, is very far right. It's very cruel, and it turns Texans into bounty hunters against each other. And it effectively denies women the right to get an abortion. Most of all because many, if not most women, don't realize that they're pregnant after just that period of time. And there is a danger, I think it's a very real danger, of two things. Number one, that other states will try to adopt a similar law. And secondly, that the Supreme Court could actually uphold it. The applicability nationwide of Roe v. Wade is very much in danger because of the law that was passed in Texas. Now, I think, this is just me as an attorney, I think the main undoing of that law may actually be the fact, in the long run, that it opens up a Pandora's box in other parts of the law by empowering citizens, including, as you're saying, non-Texans, right, perhaps,
right,
to sue other citizens in the way that it does. You know, it confers standing well beyond what we're used to in many areas of American law.
Well, it also awards the person, it rewards them with the $10,000
right.
for carrying,
And that's
having
the bounty,
a successful case.
Yeah, no, that's the bounty. You're right. It's a lawsuit that rewards a bounty. It's the government asking ordinary people to go after other ordinary people based on basically ideology. And remember that the Attorney General who is enforcing this for Texas himself is indicted for a felony. He is indicted for a felony count of fraud, and that still has not been resolved. But it's having an effect in Texas because most Texans just think it's way too severe. That you would turn people into bounty hunters, that a woman who is raped by someone would be forced to give birth to the rapist's child, which is what the law says.
Yeah.
All of these things.
One other thing, of course, there's a crisis that's going on under the bridge in Del Rio. Yet, what do we have to do? What does Congress have to do to get a grip on immigration and control of our borders?
The most important thing that Congress can do is pass immigration reform. This issue has been languishing in its latest iteration for at least the last 15 or 16 years. We came close in 2014 when the Senate passed a bill, but the House didn't. So the most important productive thing that the Congress can do through the reconciliation bill, although there's a wrestling with the Senate parliamentarian over it, is to pass immigration reform through reconciliation to resolve some of these issues. But secondly, in terms of on the ground in Del Rio is an immigrant community. My grandmother, when she came to the United States, actually came from a town that's not too far from Del Rio, Eagle Pass, Texas. So Del Rio is a town of people who are very familiar with the immigrant experience, great people in Del Rio, but it's a very tense situation. And the way that the government can be helpful is to provide the resources to process those folks who are seeking asylum, they have a right to seek asylum in the United States. And we have to take this opportunity to provide the resources on site in a way that we haven't before. And many of us have been saying that for at least a few years now, that the government has not taken the opportunity to really surge, although I don't like that word usually, but surge resources there to process people quickly. A lot of the Haitians who are fleeing here
Right.
actually have family members here. They could be placed with family members while they wait for their asylum claim to take place.
So, but the United States decided to transport many of those Haitians back to Haiti, and
Yeah.
many of those Haitians hadn't lived in Haiti in such a very long time. They'd lived in South America. So was that the right way to address it?
Look, I disagree with the administration on this, and they're using Title 42, which was invoked by Donald Trump, using COVID as a rationale, public health emergency. And first, I think that it's bad policy and sets bad precedent to continue to leave Title 42 in place and summarily expel asylum seekers when they present for asylum in the United States. Because if we continue to do it, future presidents of both parties, I believe, will continue to use that as a way to basically say out of sight, out of mind. So I don't believe that we should use, and I think Title 42, I think Chuck Schumer just went on Twitter yesterday or maybe today and made the same point that we shouldn't be using Title 42. You have to be able to process people and let them wait in the United States for their asylum claims.
Okay. Well, I've got one more question for
Please.
you, but I have to do a few closing remarks before I get to it. So I'll do that. So before I ask Congressman Castro the final question, let me just take a moment to acknowledge the organizers of today's event. Headliners co-team leaders Donna Linewan-Leger and Lori Russo, today's headliner event coordinator Peter Copeland, Club Membership Director Kate Helster, and Club Executive Director Bill McCarran. And of course, the team in the Press Club's Broadcast Operations Center, which I could not do this without. So also, I want to invite everyone to join us on Monday, September 27th at 1 p.m. to hear from Jérôme Pécresse. He is CEO of GE Renewable Energy. Mr. Pécresse will speak about the urgency to address the energy transition by focusing on modernizing the electric grid to incorporate more wind, solar, and hydropower and meet United Nations climate goals. So, as I recall, Texas had some issues with their
Absolutely.
with their power grid recently. And I really appreciate you going off topic with us, but you kind of addressed this a little bit before we got into the Q&A, but why should non-Latinos care about your effort right now, and how can non-Latinos be supportive of the action that you're pressing forward on in Congress?
Sure. Well, for different reasons. First, as I mentioned, there are other communities in America. The African American community has faced a lot of the same issues and challenges. Muslim American community, the Asian American community. So many other communities that face the same challenges in Hollywood and in media. But also, I would think that our fellow Americans would like to know something about a group of people that's almost 20% of the country, and their history and where they fit in and what contributions they've made to American society. And so I hope that others, non-Latinos as well, will join us in this push for better representation and more accurate portrayal.
So I always like to end my interviews with very important people like yourself, something fun. Your brother beat you to the punch of appearing here at the National Press Club some time ago.
Oh, that's right.
Yes,
Thank
yes.
you for reminding me.
Yes. So on the competition factor between you and your twin brother, what do you recall of being in competition with your twin brother on that you wouldn't mind sharing with our listening audience, where you guys are probably still in competition on it today?
Well, when we were growing up, we played football, basketball, and tennis. And when we would play tennis, we would get so mad at each other. I mean, we would throw the racket down and yell and everything. And we've gotten a little better now. But during the pandemic, actually, I had not played tennis in a few years. And I started playing pretty regularly with my brother because it was one of the few things you could do.
Socially distanced tennis.
That's right.
Yeah.
But I want you to know that he yells now a lot more than I do. So he's much worse than I am on the tennis court.
Well, Congressman Castro, I just want to really, really thank you for coming and discussing such an important issue with us today, especially during Hispanic Heritage Month. And I also want to thank you and give you the coveted National Press Club mug. Thank you so much for coming today. We
Thank you
appreciate
very
it. Thank you.